Let's talk a little bit about collective behavior. So um, we're gonna look at a couple of different forms of collective action over the next couple of weeks. I want to start with collective behavior. So collective action is going to be an umbrella term under which we find things like collective behavior on one side, but then also social movements on the other dimension. And we'll get to social movements a little bit later in the semester. But for right now, I want to talk a little bit about collective behavior. So let's start with collective action, though, because I want to give you guys a good overview of what we mean by that. So collective action is action that people engage in as a group, and that they formulate as a response to problematic conditions. And this is often in opposition to, say, for example, existing social norms. Uh, Two types of collective action that I've just mentioned, right? Collective behavior, and the characteristic that collective behavior kind of shares within itself is that it's spontaneous. So collective behavior is distinguished from social movements in that collective behavior is sort of spontaneous. It arises in the moment, whereas social movements are planned and organized. So both of them are collective action. But collective behavior is a particular kind of collective action that is spontaneous and unplanned. So when a large number of people get together to work out a kind of response to an ambiguous situation, right? Because we want to know what's going on. We want to know how it is we're supposed to conduct ourselves. Um, that that set of activities that forms the core of what we call collective behavior. Now, collective behavior is a thing that social psychologists have been trying to unravel and theorize about for a really, really long time. And I am not going to spend any time at all, or I should say, I'm going to spend a very, very limited amount of time on sort of the history of these theories, and instead, I'm going to kind of establish sort of a starting point, and then I'm going to cut to the chase. But again, if you're really interested in this stuff, if you want to go beyond sort of an introduction to social psychology and sort of do a deep dive, the theories of collective behavior, are there are many of them, and they're super interesting, and most of them I think are kind of wrong, but nevertheless still fascinating and interesting. I'm just going to start with the first wrong one, and then I'll take you to what is, I think, currently this sort of the state of the art when it comes to explaining collective behavior. So the preliminary theories of collective behavior were kind of organized around sort of quasi-psychological conceptions, right? And that makes a lot of sense, right? Because psychology predates sociology by about a century, maybe 75 years, right? So the disciplines um, are both relatively new, but psychology is a bit older. And so back in the 1800s, when people were theorizing about collective behavior, very often those theories would borrow heavily on concepts that were coming out of psychology, in part because the concepts that would be generated by sociology hadn't really been generated yet, right? We were still a little bit, they were there, but they were in their formative sort of stages, and sociology as an explanatory framework for human behavior was not nearly as prevalent, and even to this day is not nearly as prevalent as psychological lenses or frameworks. So back in 1895, this guy named Gustave Le Bon, who's French if you couldn't pick up on that, he wrote a book called The Crowd, A Study of the Popular Mind. And in this book, right, Le Bon is trying to explain or offer up a set of theories that would explain collective behavior. Why is it that crowds seem to act differently than the individuals that make up those crowds? And that's a totally legit question. It's one that, I think is interesting in its own right, but also because collective behavior often has pretty significant and broad social consequences, trying to understand it is an absolutely worthwhile endeavor. So he writes this book called The Crowd, in which he suggests that when people gather together in sufficiently large numbers, their minds become connected, and what is formed is something called the group mind. And he writes that the group mind is not the sum of the minds of all the individual members of the group. It's a mind of its own that's distinct from the minds that are, that are working on these different levels. So he speculates, right? He doesn't know, right? One of the things he has to answer, I guess, is how do these minds become connected, right? So that a group mind can kind of form. And he acknowledges in the book that he has no idea, right? He says perhaps it's magnetism, because magnetism was like the go-to theory back in the 1890s, I suppose, for how you explain things that you don't understand. I don't know, right? It's a fun read. It's very well. I don't know if it's fun. It's maybe fun for academic nerds, but it's an interesting read at the very least. But I think that Le Bon, even his attempts to explain this reveal that he doesn't really know all the answers, and that a lot of this is just speculative. But when he when he's asked, right, how do these minds get connected? How many minds have to come together before a group mind can form? Why does one set of behaviors emerge as sort of the preference or the intent of the group mind, given that there are individual minds within there that don't want to do those things, right? So there are lots of questions that he doesn't really have answers to, and he's just sort of speculating. Contagion theory, theories that talked about sort of the homogeneity of groups and the anonymity that groups provide for individuals that allow sort of otherwise repressed intentions and desires to emerge, right? So lots of theories between 1895 and the mid 1970s, which is where I'm going to take you next. And again, we're not going to go into any of those details because again, they're interesting, but I think they're kind of beside the point in an introduction to social psychology class. We've got kind of bigger questions to sort of grapple with in the history of theory here. But in the 1970s, two researchers, Turner and Killian, develop and put forward a contemporary theory of collective behavior that's grounded in sociological social psychology, really solidly grounded in both the things that we know to be true, just empirically verifiable things that we know to be true about groups, and also things that we've learned about human behavior in the period of time from the 1890s up to the 1970s, right? So all the data that gets collected in there goes into sort of the development of what has come to be called emergent norm theory. Now, there are a couple of things that I need to sort of establish first before we go into the details of emergent norm theory. The first is that crowds are heterogeneous. What that means is they're made up of all kinds of different people. There were some theories along the way that said, well, crowds are made up of people who have similar dispositions and attitudes and intentions, which is how you get kind of this uniformity of action. But as we gathered more data about crowds and we studied them, we actually spent time observing. I mean we as a discipline, not me personally. But as people studied the nature of crowds, they realized that more often than not, crowds are actually quite heterogeneous. They're made up of all kinds of different people. Imagine for a moment a set of speakers in Daly Plaza in downtown Chicago talking about criminal justice reform or talking about you know, an increase in the minimum wage, or pro mask mandates and social distancing, or anti-mask mandates and social distancing, right? So we get a crowd of people. Some people are there because they are passionate about that issue, right? They go to demonstrations on those topics because those are topics that they care quite a lot about. Other people go to these events because they operate within a framework of a broad desire to sort of establish social justice, and so they have a number of different issues about which they care, and they go to these sorts of things. But then there are also people in the crowd who are just curious, right? Somebody might be walking down Dearborn Street and they look over and they see a whole crowd of people in Daly Plaza, and they're like, I wonder what's going on. And they wander over, right? So they're there in that crowd as well. Some people are there because, there's a person they work with in their office who they're really attracted to. And this person has expressed a desire to go down and participate in this demonstration. And so, this other person doesn't really care about the issue, but they really like this person. So they figure, I'll go along and I'll score some points with this person, and maybe we can have coffee or drinks afterwards or something like that, right? So the point here is that the crowd itself is very, very diverse in terms of its intentions, in terms of its background and experiences, in terms of its very motivations for assembling as a crowd, right? So it's not a uniform body of like-minded people. That's the thing to keep in mind. It is also the case that people are disposed to regularly seek out patterns and meaning. We really crave structure, right? We really crave an answer to the question, what's going on here? This is such a powerful tendency in human cognition that we will actually create patterns out of completely patternless data. If you doubt me, by the way, this tendency is called apophenia. You can look it up. It's a pretty well established sort of tendency. One of the manifestations, one specific form of apophenia, is something called pareidolia, which is the tendency to see human faces in non-human objects. So if you look at the moon and you see a man in the moon, there's not. It's lava flows and craters and the light of the sun reflecting off the surface of the moon. But our minds resolve those sort of random bits of information into something that looks like a face. Or, you might look at the front of an automobile and you might see, instead of headlights and a grill, you might see two eyes and a mouth. Is how Disney and Pixar have managed to sort of anthropomorphize automobiles so that we can have the Cars movies, right? So we see these patterns, even though those patterns aren't really there. We're making them up in our head. So this is a thing. We tend to want to see structure. We tend to want to see order. And the reason we want that in our social environments is because we need to know how to behave, right? When you walk into a classroom, remember frames and schema. We've talked about those things on multiple occasions this semester. So the schema are the cognitive structures that exist inside our head into which we organize information that we take in through our senses. Frames are the kind of organized networks of schema. So a classroom as a frame tells you which kinds of schema you're going to be organizing information into. So somebody standing in front of a crowd talking can have lots of different meanings. In a classroom, it usually means that's the teacher. In an assembly, that might mean it's the guest speaker or a presenter. In the northeast corner of Hyde Park in London, it means somebody standing on a soapbox giving a political diatribe, right? So the behaviors might be very, very consistent or similar across those settings, but the schema into which you're organizing those observed behaviors will depend on the frame in which that is activated, right? The circumstances. So we really need to know how to behave, so much so that we're always looking for cues for what kinds of behaviors are going to be appropriate of us. Most of the time, we have a script, right? Most of the time, our social environments give us that information quite readily. a classroom, right, is a fairly constraining environment in which we are not likely to misinterpret particular observed behaviors because they make sense within the framework of that classroom or within the framework of an assembly. The problem is we haven't really been socialized to develop frames and thus the relevant schema for things like demonstrations. We're not socialized on how to behave in such a large, clearly diverse, clearly heterogeneous set of circumstances. But we want to know how we're supposed to behave. That the pressure is there for us to look for cues and look for information. This is, in many ways, this is a kind of role making, right? We're engaged in a situation where we need to figure out how we're supposed to conduct ourselves, but the answer is not readily apparent in the environment itself, right? Because this is, again, not something that people are socialized to. So in this kind of environment, Turner and Killian developed this thing called emergent norm theory, which says that, crowds, because they're diverse and heterogeneous, will, in the face of very ambiguous stimuli or circumstances, develop a group norm. Not a group mind, like Le Bon would say, but a group norm. And the group norm establishes the framework then for action, and it gives the crowd sort of its sense of cohesion, its sense of uniformity. It's what gets everybody sort of on the same page, if you will. So what happens is we're in this environment. Just imagine, right? We're in this large assembly in Daley Plaza, and we're all there for different reasons. And the crowd is now being told by the organizers that we are going to march from Daley Plaza to the city jail in the South Loop, right? Because it's a criminal justice demonstration. So we're going to march a few blocks to the south, and we then fall in line, right? We all start walking because now we have a key actor, somebody who is suggesting an appropriate set of actions, which we then sort of follow along with, right? How do we know who to listen to? Well, the guy with the microphone, right, and the loudspeaker, or the people on the dais, the people on the stage, right? They have distinct personalities or they have distinct behaviors. They're identified in some way as key actors. So we've established now a norm. The norm is we're all going to walk down the road. As we're walking down the road, somebody decides to throw a brick through the window of a Starbucks. I don't know, Starbucks seems to always get the worst of it in these kinds of mass demonstrations that potentially become riots, right? So, so somebody throws a brick through the window. The next thing that happens is going to be really, really integral to what kind of events unfold next. If the crowd, maybe those key actors that were leading the group, maybe other prominent people within the demonstration, if they grab that person and take him over to the side and hand him over to local law enforcement and says, here, it was this guy, right? This guy was the one who threw the rock. The message that everybody else gets is don't throw rocks, right? Because if you throw rocks, then the crowd is likely to turn on you. The message that's received is a function of the response that the crowd has to the behavior. If, on the other hand, the response of the crowd to the behavior is everyone goes, yeah, right? Now, this does not obligate you to throw rocks, but it does signal to you that if you try to grab and have law enforcement arrest somebody who does, you might reasonably infer that that crowd is going to turn on you because they seem to be tolerating this behavior. So there is a norm, right? The norm that governs the behavior, not throwing rocks, or the norm that governs behavior, throwing rocks and causing property damage, emerges in the moment, right? And it's based on the reaction of the crowd to particular patterns of behavior. The crowd is kind of creating its new norms as it goes, right? Because again, we're all looking for that kind of guidance. We're looking for those kinds of patterns. They're not things that we bring with us to that crowd, but rather things that are agreed upon in the moment, not collaboratively, like we sit down at a table and agree upon it, but agreed upon nevertheless based on how people respond. And the reason why you know it's a temporary norm that's only in place for a short period of time is that when the demonstration that has now become a riot is over and it has been dispersed and you've gone home, you're not throwing rocks through the windows of the houses you walk down the street toward your home, right? Because you understood that that norm, while it was in place during the riot, is not a norm that has been established now in society. It was contextual. It was contingent. It was only in that moment. So this is what emergent norm theory sort of tells us, right? That norms of behavior that are appropriate to the collective action situation emerge through these group processes, and it does so without like prior coordination, without prior planning. We don't sit down to sort of plan these things out, but they do emerge. They're in place for a period of time, and then they go away, right? And that is a much more robust and I think much more accurate explanation than the notion that somehow our minds become connected magnetically and a group mind emerges. And not to crap all over Gustave Le Bon, right? I mean, he was trying, and good for him, right? These are this is how we do things in science. We come up with theories, we come up with ideas, we test them, we critique them. Most of the time, we're wrong, and we build upon previous failures to build more successful and more accurate models as we go. So there are three different examples of collective behavior. The first are riots and panics. There are also rumors, which I'll talk about all of these things kind of briefly. I think the chapter does a pretty decent job of kind of unpacking them, but let me just give you a quick overview of each of these things and try to sort of explain how these things work in the context of emergent norm theory. So a riot is a kind of collective behavior in which a large number of people have kind of gathered together for the purposes of protesting some grievance, something they're upset about, and from which a violent protest or a violent demonstration emerges. Every riot has a distinct set of stages of development. So, for example, they begin with what's called a precipitating event. The precipitating event helps to signal what kind of behavior is going to be appropriate. So I'm going to make this kind of concrete by using an example from American history. I'm going to talk about the Tulsa Race Riot of 1921. In 1921, very, very, very brief version of the Tulsa Race Riot. This kid named Dick Rowland, who is a black shoeshine boy in downtown Tulsa. Boy, he was a young man. He was in like 18 or 19 years old. Tulsa at the time was a very, very economically prosperous city, right? A couple of years earlier, oil had been discovered just to the west of downtown Tulsa, and everyone was making a fortune. It was a time of racial segregation. So if you look at the city itself, it's racially segregated. There's a black part of the city, which is north of a railroad track that runs along the northern edge of downtown Tulsa. And then the rest of the city is where the white citizens live. So racially segregated city. Dick Rowland is working downtown as a shoeshine, which is actually not a bad job for somebody who doesn't have a lot of education. He's shining the shoes of relatively wealthy businessmen and oil people, and right, so it's a good place for people to make some money. The only place where these shoeshines can actually use the bathroom is the top floor of it's a tall building, but it's not like a skyscraper or anything that we think of today. But I think it was maybe 6 or 7 stories tall, so it's called the Drexel Building. To get to the top floor of the Drexel building where the restrooms were, you took the elevator. Now the elevators back then were not the modern affairs that we see today, where you walk in and you push a button and the elevator kind of automatically takes you to that destination. They were run by people, right? So you had what's called an elevator operator would get in, they'd close the gates, they'd engage the cables, the car would go up, they'd disengage the cable and set the brake so that the car would stop at the floor that you needed to get off on. This job was done very often by young girls. Again, when I say girls, I mean like young women, right? 18, 19, 20 years old. In this case, a girl named Sarah Page. White girl named Sarah Page. So Dick Rowland and Sarah Page know each other because she runs the elevator in the Drexel building, and the Drexel building's the only place this guy can use the restroom. So these are not strangers to one another. They've seen each other. At the very least, they're on speaking terms. We don't know very much about anything else about their relationship, but we do know that they weren't strangers. So one day, somebody who's working in one of the retail stores in the Drexel building hears Sarah scream and sees Dick Rowland running out of the elevator. Nobody knows, well, I shouldn't say nobody, right? Dick Rowland knew and Sarah Page knew what happened inside that elevator, but nobody else did. Nevertheless, a black man running away after a white woman screams, 1921, racially segregated Tulsa, this is not good, right? So the local newspaper is whipping up the white citizens of the city of Tulsa because they want to see this kid get lynched. They want to see him killed. They're making all kinds of assumptions about what he did and why he did it. Dick Rowland gets arrested, and the sheriff locks him in the courthouse building, the city jail, to prevent him from being lynched by this white mob that's forming in front of the courthouse. Meantime, like right up the street, like not even a half a mile away, is the black community of Tulsa, right? The black neighborhood of Tulsa, which is called the Greenwood District. It's when you have a racially segregated city, the thing you have to remember is it's like a city inside a city. So there are wealthy black people, and there are middle-class black people, and there are working-class black people, and they all live in this part of Tulsa. So it's kind of like, a city with all the economic and socioeconomic variation that you'd find. But it's confined to this geographic space on the north side of downtown Tulsa. And a lot of white people are super jealous. Like poor white people who have been told over and over and over again by their society and by their culture how much better they are than black people are looking over at these, theaters that are owned by black people. They're looking at black doctors and surgeons and lawyers and newspaper owners. It's like, wait a minute, that doesn't make any sense, right? If I'm a working class, can't afford to keep my lights on white guy, and I'm looking over here in this neighborhood and I see these very, very affluent black people driving nice cars and wearing nice fancy clothing, I got a little bit of cognitive dissonance here because that's not supposed to be the case. I'm supposed to be better than these people. So there's a lot of racial resentment that's kind of bubbling around in the city of Tulsa that all kind of predate the events of May 31st and June 1st of 1921. So Dick Rowland is in the jail. A white mob has assembled in front of the jail to try to break him out of there so they can go hang him. A group of blacks come down the street from the Greenwood District, which, as I said, is just right down the street from the courthouse. They assemble there for the purposes of trying to turn away this lynch mob. And the sheriff is like, hey, let's everybody go home. Now, he can't really say let's everybody go home because he can't tell white people what to do as easily as he can tell black people what to do. So he tells the blacks to go back and that he promises that he'll protect Dick Rowland, and he just wants to try to defuse the situation. There's a scuffle as a white member of the mob is trying to disarm a black man, right? Trying to take away his gun. There's a scuffle and somebody fires a shot. And that shot signals to everybody else, like, that's what this is going to be. We're going to be shooting at each other. There's an initial volley of gunfire, and then both groups kind of retreat. And a number of people have been killed, both white and black. The blacks, very easily able to get back into their neighborhood, which, as I said, is just a couple blocks down the road. Whites go back into the larger part of the city, and they're going to find friends. They're going to try to get more guns. They actually try to break into a National Guard armory to steal like actual much more lethal weapons. And then later on that night, they invade the north side of the city. They invade the Greenwood district, and they start setting fires, and they start shooting people, and they start looting, right? So that is what we call the confrontation phase, right? When the two groups kind of initially have this sort of protracted and engaged confrontation. It's very interesting. Sometimes a precipitating event is immediately followed by the confrontation phase. In this instance, there's a little bit of a time lag, right, between that initial fight in front of the courthouse and the invasion of the Greenwood district later that night. When all previous norms have been sort of completely obliterated by the norms that have emerged that are governing the behavior of the people in the riot at that point, that's what's called the carnival phase. Carnival sounds like it's fun, but think of it as like a sort of anything goes sort of environment, right? So this is the stage of a riot in which the previous norms that exist, like don't set fire to a person's house or don't shoot them as they run out to avoid the flames, right? Those norms have been replaced by set fire to houses and kill the people as they run out, because those are the norms that are governing the behavior of white people as they invaded the north side of the city. And then the siege phase is when previously existing norms are sort of reasserted by the emergence of, say, for example, the law, or in the case of Tulsa in 1921, the arrival of the National Guard. And the National Guard in Tulsa in 1921 brought the massacre to an end by arresting all the black people. Again, very, very easy to do because whites are relatively more powerful and have a greater social standing than the blacks. So even though it was the whites who invaded the neighborhoods and the communities on the north side of the city, and the whites were massacring the black citizens of the city of Tulsa, the National Guard basically brought the massacre to an end by arresting all the black people. So by the end of the day, on June 1st, every black person in Tulsa was either dead, had fled the city, or was being held by the National Guard, right? So that, again, lots of different examples, but that's one that I happen to know quite a lot about. I grew up in the city of Tulsa, so I've got this kind of interest in and this connection with the stuff that happens back in 1921. So that's an example of a riot. And again, all riots will have the same four stages: precipitating event, confrontation phase, carnival phase, siege phase. Rumors are another form of collective behavior. A rumor is basically the spread of information that's neither substantiated nor refuted, right? So it's not confirmed, but it can't be you can't disabuse people of believing it, right? Because that's the nature of a rumor. It is something that we think might be true, but we can't confirm one way or the other. So in the process of the emergence and the spread and the operation of a rumor, it goes through a series of stages, right? There's the leveling, which is when during the repeated telling of a rumor, some of the original details start to drop out, right? So the rumor becomes more sort of uniform, but also vague, right? It starts to lose some of its original level of detail in favor of a broad narrative. Followed by a process that we call sharpening, which is where some aspects of that leveled rumor start to get emphasized. So the things that people think are really important, those are the things that are going to get picked up on and repeated. And then assimilation refers to the process that occurs during which the story starts to get transformed so that it fits with preconceived biases or preconceived expectations. So I think you could sort of look at the you can sort of look at like again, the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. The events that preceded that were the whatever incident occurred in the elevator in the Drexel building, followed by the spread of stories about that event among the citizens of the city of Tulsa. And by the time this mob has assembled and has shown up in front of the courthouse steps, the narrative is that this black man assaulted this white woman in an elevator. And the appropriate response to that is to exercise some extrajudicial, punishment in the form of a lynching. Again, as I pointed out, nobody really knows what happened between Sarah and Dick, except for Sarah and Dick. But the details of the original events that kind of came out of what happened in the elevator become this kind of broad story about how, we heard, we go from the elevator door opened, we heard a scream, a black man ran out, right? That's really all that the people who witnessed the event knew. But by the time the Tulsa Tribune, which is the local newspaper, by the time they're running stories about this, the story is that this black man assaulted this white woman. And later on, of course, it becomes part of this broader narrative of the way in which black people are, and black men specifically in the early 1900s, are a threat to the virtue of white women. That's the bias and the prejudice of the crowd, right? And by the time they arrive on the steps of the courthouse, this is not just getting this one guy for doing this one thing. This is sending a message to every other black man that if you do anything with white women that we don't approve of, this will be the punishment that you can expect, right? So you can kind of see that leveling, sharpening, and assimilation process in the things that led up to the Tulsa Race Massacre. That would be sort of the way that rumor worked. All right, last thing is a panic. A panic is another form of collective behavior. It's spontaneous. It's a situation in which norms emerge in the moment, in the process. Now, the interesting thing about panics is that they also involve an emotional state. Specifically, the emotional dimension to a panic is an overriding sort of emotional state that increases danger. Right, so somebody who is drowning begins to panic, which makes it very difficult to rescue them because their behavior actually increases the risk both to themselves but also to the people who are potentially in a position to rescue them. Right, so that's the thing that's a little bit different about a panic. So when people in a crowd respond to an immediate threat, or at least the perception of an immediate threat with this highly charged emotional behavior, danger increases rather than decreases, and that's kind of the insidious nature of a panic. And again, there are some elements, right? These are there's some we call shaping factors that are in operation during a panic. Partial entrapment, perceived threat, breakdown of escape routes, and a failure of front to rear communication. What that looks like is and by the way, these are all what we call necessary conditions, right? So you take any one of these things out of the equation and you don't get a panic, right? So like panics don't occur in wide open fields where people can escape from a threat by running in any direction, right? So people will run because you want to get away from a threat, but you're not going to run away in such a way that actually increases the danger to you and the people around you. If, on the other hand, you're enclosed where there are a limited number of ways to get out, then that makes a panic much more likely to occur because you're now partially entrapped. So the partial entrapment refers to, it doesn't have to be that you're indoors. You could be, for example, at the bottom of a very narrow canyon, right? Open to the sky above, you're outside. But if a wall of water is coming down the canyon and you can't climb the sides, then you're going to run away from the water, knowing even though you're not going to be able to outrun it, right? You're going to panic. You're going to get into that kind of emotional state in which you engage in behavior that increases the risk to you and to people around you, because you're not being reasonable anymore. You're being overwhelmed by your emotions. So partial entrapment, perceived threat, the escape routes need to be in a process of breaking down. So what that means is that people know that there is a way out, but they also have a sense that the way out may not be indefinitely available, right? That it may break down. It may not be available by the time you get there. That's what leads to the panicky behavior. And then, of course, the inability for people at the front who kind of know the full nature of the situation and circumstances cannot communicate that information to the people in the back. So, in the 1960s in, I want to say Cincinnati, I hope I'm getting that right, there was a concert by the Guess Who, or maybe it was the Who. It's a long time ago, before my time. But in that event, a bunch of people had arrived at the venue, and they were kind of all queued up at the doors waiting to get in, and they heard what sounded like the band, right? It was actually just musicians. It was the roadies performing a sound check. But outside the venue, by the doors, people thought that the band had started, but the doors in front of them were not open. And their fear was that the doors elsewhere into the venue had been opened and people were streaming in, and they were going to get all the best seats because it was an open seating arrangement on the floor in front of the stage. And so the whole crowd surges forward, and they push the people at the front of the crowd up against the doors, which are not open, right? And those people ended up getting crushed. Right, so there you have. You've got a partial entrapment, right? There's the group of people who need to kind of move in a direction that is kind of determined by where the event that they want to get to is, which is inside the venue. The perceived threat is, hey, there aren't going to be seats left if we don't act now. So they start to move forward because they hear the music and they think the concert has begun. The breakdown of the escape route is, again, this idea that I'm not going to be able to get in. I'm not going to be able to get my seat. And the people at the front, the ones who know that the doors are not, in fact, actually open yet, can't tell that to the people behind them because they're being crushed up against the doors. And it's really hard when people are screaming and shouting and you have the air in your lungs kind of being pushed out by the weight of the crowd behind you. So lots of different examples of this. I think the chapter might talk about the E2 nightclub event in Chicago back in, I think it was 2002, maybe 2003. So in the early 2000s, there was a nightclub in Chicago called E2 that had a very sort of famous panic where people were trying to get out of a building in response to what they thought was a threat of poison gas. And a bunch of people got crushed in the bottom of a stairwell because the people behind them were pushing against them, but the door at the bottom of the stairwell opened in, so the people at the front couldn't open the door in because all these people behind them were pushing forward. And of course they couldn't tell them that because everyone was screaming, and because they were being asphyxiated by the weight of the crowd behind them, right? So that's again an example of the way in which these factors played a role in shaping the behavior of the people in those circumstances. All right, well, that's kind of a bummer place to end it, but that's kind of where we kind of bring this one to a close. So I hope this makes sense. I hope this gives everyone a really clear sense of what we're talking about when we talk about collective behavior. As I said, we'll talk about other forms of collective action later in the semester, but I wanted to make sure you guys had a really good sense of this. So as always, feel free to ask questions in class or shoot me an email if any of these things aren't clear to you. And I'll just say until next time, take care.